Hello everybody, I'm going to be recording a video tonight demonstrating how to complete the first try it out exercise in chapter 1. And this is on page 6. There is a try it out that comes prior to this, and I just want to point this out real quick, that has you install this old version of Visual Studio Express 2012, which we're not doing. And the videos that we're recording during the summer semester of 2019, we've decided to move up to Visual Studio 2019 for doing our work. So down to page 6. Now the first thing I'm going to mention is if you have not installed Visual Studio 2019 yet, you need to do that. If you want to work with an older version, that's great. You can look back at the previous videos on working through the exercises. And I might not be recording these every week here during the summer of 2019. It just kind of depends. The biggest hurdle we need to get over is what it looks like being different than what you're seeing in your book, and then what you're seeing in my videos as well, so that you get used to the templates that you need to pull up to do your work. I feel that some of it with this new release is not maybe as intuitive as it could be. That's why these videos exist. So once you have the product fully installed, we're going to be launching Visual Studio. So you can go to your Start menu and just start typing Visual Studio. Hopefully it should pop up. Once it does, please go ahead and launch the project or product. And you can see it's got a fancy new look on the splash screen. And on top of it all, when you go into the product, it has this start screen, right, that prompts you to either open up something you've already been working on, or choose one of the options on the right to create a new project. But what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to skip all this for right now. This is the start screen that used to be present in the previous versions that usually sat on top of the product. What I think is a little confusing on Visual Studio 2019, at least at first view, is the product's not open in the background and you get this splash screen. So you feel like the product's not running, but it actually is. So what I'd like to do, just to get us into the environment, is I'm going to choose this option way down here, Continue Without Code, just so we can get into the product, and then we can see that it still looks like Visual Studio, at least what I'm normally used to. Now, I may have mentioned this in other videos, but I've worked with this product for a really long time and gone through many iterations of it. So whenever they change a version, you always pensively walk into the new version to see what changes are made. And this one's no different. So they always do a little something to make you feel uncomfortable. But my goal is to make you feel comfortable again. Of course, if you've never worked with the product, this is going to be your baseline. For me, it makes me feel a little uncomfortable, frankly. All right, so I'm going to go to the File menu here, and I'm going to click on New. And I'm trying to keep in mind that there's instructions in the background I'm trying to follow in the book. But right off the bat, I want to point out that there are differences in the versions. In our book, when you look at the start screen that you see in the older versions of Visual Studio are embedded directly into the product, basically as another tab that you can close. So what I in essence just did is I had that start screen come up and got rid of it just to go into the product. And frankly, that's always been my work habit, is whenever I would launch into this product, I rarely would select from stuff that I had been working on, because I'm usually teaching, not actually doing production work. So I'd always be starting a new thing, so I would just kind of summarily dismiss the start page. What might work for you, though, is if you are working on particular pieces of homework, you get halfway done, you save it, you close it, you come back, you can relaunch it right from there. But there are some caveats here, and I'll explain those as we go. The fact that it comes up in your recent project list, if it so happens to, is based upon the fact that you're choosing certain project templates. Some project templates will appear here, and some will not. And that's kind of a little tricky area to walk initially. All right, so I'm trying to get to like the first major instruction here, which I guess is in step 3. And here they're asking you to go to the File menu choose New Website. So let's go back to Visual Studio really quick. And the first thing you're going to notice as you go to File, New, okay, it doesn't exist. Okay. Because in this product, they've decided, actually since version 2015, that they're not going to list websites as one of the new options, that you have to go into the project templates for the very first option in order to be able to pull that up. It is important when you make these selections that you select the right template with the right languages and the right platforms. Because what happens if you don't is you will diverge very quickly from what you're seeing in the book and what we're doing in class and get presented with completely different tool sets. So really what you're declaring here is what language, what operating system, what your output mechanism is going to be, whether it's a web or an operating system native application. That's all determined from these windows. So I'm going to go to File, New, Project. And then I get back to, guess where? Right back to that same start screen that they were kind of pushing us towards. Now keep in mind, on the left-hand side is a big blank white area, but if I had worked in this product previously, it would have a list of my recent project. Strangely enough, when I opened it and it came up as a start page, there was a list there. Do you remember seeing that? On the left-hand side, that was populated with a whole list of projects I had worked on previously. This is not showing that for some reason, and you know what? It's a new product, so I don't know why. I am assuming it's because I chose Create New Project, so it's assuming I'm not concerned about my recent projects. Now, I think it's kind of fascinating. It also eliminated, there was an area off here to the side that gave you different ways to pull up code, either from online repositories, your own repositories, from what they call cookie cutter examples online, where yes, they have stuff that's kind of pre-built, and at this point we're going to stay away from that. But we need to make some clever choices here. Our book is written to support two programming languages, both Visual Basic and C#. We discussed last week that the focus language in this course is going to be C#, and that's where we're going to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the language selector here, and I'm going to choose C# from the drop-down. I want you to notice that as a result of all my installs here, what other languages are available to you natively with the selections that I made. It's a pretty extensive list. All right, so we're choosing C#. Now what that does is every time I'm clicking these drop-downs, it's filtering through all the possible project templates, and there are many. And we're trying to boil it down to the ones that we want. Now Microsoft, you know, in its usual fashion, is trying to push certain things on you. And I want you to take notice here that if you install the .NET Core libraries, and those are the cross-platform libraries, so you could code for Mac and Linux as well with these, they want you to explore that and use it. But those do not match up with traditional .NET programming, so we're avoiding those for right now. At some point in the near future, I predict that these may eventually overtake traditional .NET. We'll see. Microsoft is clearly moving towards cross-platform in all their ventures, basically. Now, the platform that we're working with, of course, is Windows. And why this is important is in an ASP.NET website, we're assuming that the code that we're going to write, which is going to compile, is going to run on a Windows server. So that's why I have to make this selection. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to select the project type, and you can see all the different things. So of course all the young kids are going to go to games, right? All the geeky people are going to go to some of the other ones. But what we're shooting for as a web developer is we want the web templates because that's our goal. All right. So now that I've done that, we have boiled it down to something that is a little bit more manageable. We don't have a huge scroll bar now. It looks like we can maybe scroll a screen or two and look at all the different things that have come up. And not that we're going to be able to explore all of these during this class, but I just want to show you what's out there. Really, the two main ones that they have here for us are the top one. So the first one, notice it says ASP.NET Core, and this is the one that a lot of students will click on accidentally because it's at the top, right? And who can blame them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've done it too, so, you know. But notice the little boxes underneath it, how it says Windows, Linux, Mac, and Web. That's great, really. And in principle, why wouldn't you code for that, right? Right. So that is a great goal for Microsoft. Right now, that is a very, very young development approach, and a lot of developers are shying away until it kind of like builds its, you know, its, I don't know, popularity or whatever, or stability before people go into it full force. For now, we are still working with the .NET platform, and that, of course, is built on top of Windows. So we're going to choose that second option.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So what I'm not grasping is what's the difference between the two? Obviously, I see the platforms, or the OSs are less on the second one, but is that the only difference?
So when you deploy the application and it needs to run its compiled code, it needs to be on a Windows machine. So it uses those specific traditional libraries. The other platform is designed to be multi-platform, and I'm not sure how they're doing it, the mechanics behind it, but they're coming up with some sort of a common runtime library that will work on all of those platforms.
I guess that's what you're saying earlier, is that's why the top one is the newer. The bottom is more specific to Windows.
That's correct.
Okay.
It is.
I noticed when I accidentally clicked the first one, when I first went into it, I couldn't find it was.
Right. It does not have the same tools.
So I splashed it, started over, and clicked the second one, and then I was productive.
Right. Now, to make this even more confusing, if you look at what comes up in the book, let's jump back over there, because I know that those of you that might be working with the older versions will see a setup that looks more like this window, where on the left-hand side you'll have this tree that Microsoft develops for you. And the way that this one works, and you want to be really careful with this, is you want to make sure that before you select ASP.NET website that you also look at the development language that goes with it, right? Because you can accidentally click on the Visual Basic version. So everything that's in the Visual Basic version also appears in the C# version. We are focusing on C#, so make sure that you, at the root of your selection tree here on the left, C# is at the root. The other thing that you're going to find with Visual Studio 2015 and 17 is once you click that C#, it will also have a little branch underneath for web, and then underneath web are the ASP.NET templates. So you kind of have to tunnel down a little bit. We're not going to see that in 2019 quite the same way. They're not giving you as many direct options. One thing that I found interesting during the install process, and I recorded this into my video prior to class start, was the fact that when we were installing ASP.NET and the core libraries, they had a little checkbox on the right-hand side that said, retrieve the old libraries. Do you want to have all the old frameworks available? And I opted no, because I don't think anybody will look for it, so I want to mimic what the students are doing. But it is possible to pull all these back by clicking that checkbox. And really all that does is it brings down some settings that allows it to operate in a specific way. So this is the 2012 version that you see here. If you want to see what the 2017 version looks like, I would go back to my pre-existing videos in the course shell that are marked 2017 and look at those. I think that'll be the best way to proceed. All right, let's go ahead and actually click through and make the selection. We're going to go ahead and say next, and then we're presented with this screen. Now, in the previous version, you would kind of do that all at once, and this isn't really a good example of this. So what they're basically doing on this old screen is you select your template for doing your work, and then you select where you're going to store it. And there's many different options for that. In the new version, they're taking you to this interface, and this is where you want to be really careful about the selections that you make. I'm not going to delve really deep into file management at this point, but when we go into the next chapter is when I usually do that.
You just select the first one. It says core
Oh, I did select the first one. Good catch. Because I went back and forth and I chose the wrong one. Thank you. All the people watching the video are screaming the same thing, I'm sure. Yes, I have a student here that caught me doing it. Okay, so here we are. Back to the .NET framework. Now that's actually an interesting choice because you notice here that there's a difference between the two frameworks. And the one thing is when you're working with .NET, not only you have the other three boxes that are already existing, but you have the actual framework because you can actually choose which version of .NET you're authoring for. Now Microsoft believes you should always author for the latest thing, okay? And you know what? I think as a general rule of thumb, I think that's fine. Especially if you got new features that you want to employ. If you know that the machines that you're distributing your software to might be locked down, like in a corporate environment, if you're building a corporate or enterprise application, and let's say everybody's still using Windows 7, or God forbid, Windows XP, then you would be backtracking to some older frameworks because some of those older machines cannot run the newer frameworks, or it's too taxing for them to run it, so you might downgrade. For the most, for most situations, I wouldn't touch that, so we should be okay just leaving this alone. If we find that there's a problem, I'll come back and change it. All right, let's talk about what you're naming things and where you're storing files. Now, for right now, I want you just to leave the location alone because I'm not going to ask you to submit your code. But if you want to find the code that Visual Studio creates, it by design is now storing it in your user directory. And I want to be really clear on this. That is not your documents directory. So if you were to dig into your file system, right, and you were to go to, let's say, documents, and you start looking at stuff, well, you can see it's got all this Visual Studio stuff here, but that's not where your code ends up. It actually ends up, on your C drive, in your users directory, under your account, and then they have what they call a source directory, and then inside of repos. So what's a repo? Somebody came and took my car?
Repository.
It's a repository of code. So that's a short. And they're using old school open source kind of lingo for that too, which I like, which is fine. And you can see I do have some stuff in here, probably from the last time I taught this class. And I'm just going to leave it there. I really don't care right now. But a local hard drive is, okay, if Visual Studio consistently does this, we know where to find your files. But what happens if somebody comes and grabs your laptop? Yeah. SOL is right. But I'm going to push you to put your files wherever works for you. If you want to leave them here, that's fine. That doesn't work for me. So my pattern is I find one of my cloud storage mechanisms. So for example, you can see up here I've got my Google Drive is mapped as a drive letter, or I have OneDrive, I also have Dropbox, I have a few other cloud storage software packages that I run. And you could store it in any one of those places. Of course, any cloud-based storage, you never in risk of losing your files. So we'll get deep into that next week. Maybe even later tonight. It just kind of depends on how things go. All right, so let's come back here. For right now, let's not worry about what we're calling it. I think the book probably tells you to call it something specific, and I guess you should probably follow those instructions. Oh, and I see they're not actually asking you to name it at this point, are they? Yeah, don't worry about what what it's named at this point. All right, back over. I'm going to leave it as web app 1, leave it in the default directory, and then I want to talk about the solution name. Isn't it bad enough I have to name what I'm doing? And well, let me talk about what a solution file is first. If you've had intro to programming, where you built applications, Windows Forms applications, Visual Basic, or C#, there's a really good chance that you are familiar with what a solution is. A solution is basically, I think of it as kind of like a pointer file that sits with your project that contains information or points to all the resources that are part of the project. So you can find that solution file in a file system, double click it, and then it'll open up all the stuff that's associated with the project. And that sounds like a great thing. What I would recommend is if you choose to name the solution a certain way, different than your project, I wouldn't recommend that, but you could. When you build a small project, I would recommend checking this box. Now, that takes the solution file and puts it in the same folder where all your code is. And I think that's convenient if it's a small project. However, when you build big projects, you'll start to discover that sometimes big programming projects are really collections of smaller projects put together, and then you might choose to put that in a directory all by itself, so that solution file can point to all the projects that are part of that big project. So lots of little programs making one big program. Well, the solution file would be in a separate directory. So what would happen is, let's say I call this web app 1, it creates a root folder, puts in a solution file, and then creates subfolders for all the other stuff.
Oh, yeah.
To me, that becomes a little watered down if you're just creating one program. So therefore, I tend to check that box for smaller projects. All right? And the solution name does not need to match the project name. I just think it makes sense to do that. All right, go ahead and click create, and let's see what happens. Oh wait, now we see the stuff that looks like the old Visual Studio. And you know what, if I sound surprised, I absolutely am, because this is the first time I'm using the product. So you guys are getting to listen to me record a video like I'm an expert on this the very first time I'm doing it. And I'm not afraid to admit that, because you know what, this is IT, folks, and this will be your life going into the future. You got to embrace it and roll with it. I'm like, whew, this makes me feel more comfortable, because now I can relate it back to what I know. And you notice that the selection that they're making in the book, and I don't know why that's selected, it says ASP.NET empty website. So, hey, I got empty as a choice here. Yay! Now, depending on the kind of thing that we're going to build, we will make different selections here. In the past, when we would do traditional ASP.NET programming, most often we'd either work with something empty or we work with web forms. Those of you that have done Windows Forms application, it's kind of like the web equivalent. So you're pulling in form elements, drop-down boxes, text fields, buttons, they're pre-built. So we need that in place if you know you're going to use those tools. So we just call it web forms. With empty, it does exactly what it sounds like. It doesn't pre-configure anything. Does not mean that you can't add anything you want into it. But if you know you're going a certain direction, you may as well steer for it right off the bat and get all the tools you need. You know, so it's like if you're going to build, let's say, a cement wall, you get your cement working tools as opposed to your hammer and your saw. You know, so it's a different set of tools. That's really all this is. You'll notice that there's other choices here too. MVC, which is something that we go into in the ASP.NET 2 class, along with the other two options, which are Web API and the single page application. And the single page application is a real big thing right now. It drives a lot of mobile development. Now, I'm going to go back here and I'm going to do a couple of comparisons. It seems like they're just checking, okay, ASP, empty website, Visual Basic. All right, I don't see that they're like choosing any other options for you. So I don't think that we're going to worry about web forms, MVC, Web API, but notice that this is different than selecting these options. This gives you all the tools. This just creates the folders and some of the key files. A little bit different, but a lot of flexibility there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and...
Can I ask one more thing?
Yes, absolutely.
When I did this, I first checked configure for HTTPS and got all kinds of errors. Came back, redid it, unchecked it. Then I could launch my website without getting it.
Right.
So for class periods, should we just uncheck configure for HTTPS?
Absolutely. Now Microsoft, clearly, they want us to use HTTPS, But as learning web developers, what happens is in order for you to get that S on your HTTP, you got to buy a certificate. Certificates are expensive, and we certainly wouldn't load them up on Gateway's equipment. So yeah, that is a wise choice. So I'm glad you stopped me before I clicked it. So let's uncheck that. So basically what that prepares you for is creating a secure application. And if your machine is configured with a certificate to be able to publish it and run it, you'll be fine. But for now, let's uncheck that. You can always add it back in later. Let's go ahead and click Create. Now, at this point, what it's doing is it's pre-building the file and folder structure and then putting in all the tools and things that you asked for by virtue of the selections that you made. All right? And it's interesting where they place you here. On the right-hand side, top section, is a portion of Visual Studio we call the Solution Explorer. And I want you to be really careful about understanding what the Solution Explorer is. If you've worked with Java, and depending on whatever tool you've used, let's say you've used Eclipse, for example. In that tool, we have what we call, I think it's called the Package Explorer. And that's an equivalent to what this is. It will show files and folders here. And you can interact from your file system directly to this interface. You can drag and drop files in and do things of that nature. However, it is not actually file management in the traditional sense, because it is also listing things that are kind of like settings for the project, and then files that you cannot alter that are part of the project anyway by virtue of the template that you chose. So there's also a possibility that depending on what selections you have made up here in your toolbar, how much it's showing you. So you notice the little toolbar right above the Solution Explorer. I'm hovering over an icon and it says show all files, right? If you click that, all of a sudden this other stuff pops up that wasn't there before that really you should not be messing with. These are things that are generated directly by the .NET libraries, and typically you don't need to see. Sometimes you go in there looking for things or making little corrections, but generally speaking we leave that off. All right, let's jump back over to the book really quick and see what they want us to do next. All right, so they show you here, and I don't think that we did this quite right, because what they did here, I think that we're going to have to redo this again. Okay, and I'm not disappointed by that, because I look here and I go, oh my God, they have all these. Well, we did see some of these folders, right? We saw a bin folder, but there's content and images and scripts and about and default, and we're not getting any of that at all. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to review these instructions and see what I might have missed. So let's see if we can figure it out. Right. I'm not seeing like any specific instruction that would have gave us what they have here, which is actually a full-blown website. I think that we may have made an error in perhaps the way that we did this. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to try the process again, and no harm done, right? Practice makes perfect. But I want to show you the proper way to close a project too. If you ever see a code up in this window, and you might have multiple code windows, simply closing the X does not close your project. And those of you that have worked with Visual Studio before will know this. Really what you need to do is come up to the File menu and choose Close Solution, which closes everything that solution file points to, and then look at what it does. It puts you back to where you were before. So I'm going to go back in. I'm going to repeat the process. We're just going to repeat the same steps. So C sharp, Windows, and Web. ASP Web Application for the .NET Framework. Web Application 2 is fine by me. And it doesn't seem like it's giving me anything different here than what I saw before. So this must be the spot where we need to make the right selections. So I'm thinking here a couple of different things. First, I'm going to go back to the book again, and I'm going to take a look. And I'm thinking, I'm looking at these things. So they used 4.5. We're still working with a programming language. Everything, I don't see anything that's really weird at all. Now the question is, how do we get it to throw in all this stuff if we're not selecting some of these other options? So last time we left these blank and we left this unchecked. And then what we really want to do, yes?
You have to select web forms.
Yeah, and notice where my mouse was? Because I know that the stuff that they're showing in the book, and that's very astute, because obviously you've done this already, the stuff that they're showing here requires web, this is all web form content. So I'm going to go ahead and actually choose it.
So you're not choosing web forms on the left, you're still selecting empty and then adding.
Yeah, there's going to be two different, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. So my student here is pointing out, because here I am ready to just add the folders and core references, which I know will give you those folders. But will it give me all the same stuff? And the truth is, no. See, in the old days, they didn't have the multiple versions. So I'm going to go ahead and just choose this. And there's no harm done. All we're going to see is a difference.
To see what it does and check
Yeah.
the box.
Yeah, of course it does, right? That's all it does, and that's exactly my point. You see how clever? So you choose the one or choose the other, and it does the same thing. So now all of a sudden, we have all the folders, and notice the file that they want us to look at, default ASPX, is on the right. All right, so this is kind of a good learning moment here too, I think. So we look at these files. Now, I didn't create these files. I didn't create these folders. All I did is make a selection from the screen, and boom, like the structure is already there for me. Now what they'd like us to do in the book is to work with this, right? So now we have something that looks kind of like that, so I feel a little more comfortable, right? And hopefully you guys are too. Now it says open the default ASPX file, and I want you to notice like what this book does. Like right here it says by double clicking it. Yes, you can do that, okay? And it says remove all the code. Let's one step at a time here. So I want to talk about how Visual Studio works, because what you guys are going to notice when you read these instructions, and I think I mentioned it last week, is the author will go through this like systematic approach of like, the first time I'll tell them to double click. The second time I'll tell them to single click. The third time I'll tell them to right click. The fourth time I'll tell them to drag and drop. And they all lead to the same thing. So the point is, we need to look at this file. You can do any one of the things I just said. So I can just single click it. It took a second. I did not double click. I single clicked and it still opens it. But notice where I put the tab. On the right side. Because I single clicked. That's viewing. If I want to change it, right? And I just type a space. Notice where it moved to. Jump to the other side. So I could have got to that same spot by double clicking it. So you can actually look at a file and not change it by single clicking. Double clicking it opens it, right click can open it, drag and drop can open it.
So that means you can't accidentally change something if you're doing a single click.
Exactly. So I kind of got in a habit when I was just checking stuff out to remember to single click. But I always remember that Visual Studio always puts that little asterisk right up here that shows you that it's not saved. Okay. And so, well, first of all, whoa, where did all this come from, right? I mean, I recognize some things, right? First of all, I'm noticing this does not look like HTML. Well, kind of, wait, hold on, it is HTML, or is it? Well, it's ASP.NET and HTML combined, along with perhaps some other things as well. So if you ignore these top two lines. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you a couple little tricks here. So we're looking at like usability things here, and I'll try to repeat these over and over. But the first thing I'm noticing is, well, if I scroll to the right, I still have code off to the right. That's not cool. Can I word wrap this? Sure. My eyes aren't that great. Can I make that bigger? Oh yeah. Like hold on your control key and scroll forward, or control plus. Oh, I guess control plus doesn't work in this environment, unless I'm actually in the window. I don't know. Yeah, that doesn't work. So you can scroll forward or scroll back holding the control key. That's one way you can zoom in. A lot of people just come down here and change their zoom. Whatever it takes to be able to see the code clearly. I tend to make things pretty big in class for a couple of reasons. First of all, people in the back of the room can see it. And frankly, so I can see it. There's no reason to strain your eyes, folks. If you're straining your eyes or your screen's dim, you're hurting yourself. So don't do that to yourself. All right. I don't like this non-word wrapping, so that's the first thing I'm going to turn on. So let's jump into the tools menu real quick and go down to options. Now, Visual Studio's options menu is about as complicated as the product itself. It's a very, very robust options menu. But what we're looking for is to change word wrap, and the spot where you do that is right here under text editor. So I'm going to click on text editor. I'm going to expand the tree and then go to that first option, which is general. And of course they moved it. Thank you, Microsoft. I know. I'm so much for being an expert, right? So here, notice that they have word wrap, but it doesn't have a check mark, it has a box. That means for some languages it's turned on and for others it's not. That's what that indicates. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on word wrap. So I got to turn it off first and then back on. And then what I also like to do is turn on this visual glyph. The other thing that you might want to do is turn on line numbers, because I just think that's helpful. That way when you get a compiler error that says go to line 324, you don't have to count. You can just look for the number. All right, so that's about it for right now. But notice where it is word wrapping, it gets that little icon in there to show you that it's word wrapping. Some people think it's cheesy. Frankly, I think it's helpful. That I know that now I do not need to scroll left and right to get to my stuff. Back to the anatomy of the page. Take a look at the very top. We're looking at a file called, okay, hold on a second. It's not called index.html like I was taught. A home page should be titled. All bets are off, right? So in ASP.NET, somebody clever at Microsoft decided, well, first of all, capital letters are okay. We were taught index.html's got to be all lowercase. In fact, let's go with a capital D, and let's call it default. And it was really kind of Microsoft's way of saying, you know what? ASP.NET is different than HTML, even though it incorporates it. And that's fine. And notice that we have a 4-letter file extension that's ASPX. And when we see that X, it denotes that we're working on the .NET platform. You will, in really, really old web applications, and we're talking, in the 20-year-old range at this point, so you probably won't see many of them, you will find web pages out there that are .ASP. Now I'm going to test a really quick theory. I always ask students, like, what websites do you go to learn about technology? And everybody's like, well, I go to W3 Schools, right? And for a long time, and I'm here for a reason, and I'm just randomly clicking on something. I want you to just notice this really quick. So W3 Schools, the big proponent of HTML, builds their website using 20-year-old ASP technology. I'm not really sure of the rationale. They have some reason for doing it. You know what? I might look at the back end and it might be all HTML, right? We really don't know. But that indicates the original version of ASP, which is a scripting language. We will learn a tiny little bit of it, but we really pretty much consider it dead. if you were to get a job working with it, you should question that job. Because really you're taking care of a legacy application at that point. Not that you can't do great work with it, I'm just telling you, and I think it's kind of interesting. All right, so ASPX is our file extension. Default is our default home page. Now, here's the question I get. Well, what if I wanted an index.html or an index ASPX? Is that okay? Sure. You know, in fact, what's different about an application that's built in .NET for web is you can actually tell this engine which is your home page. It does not have to be default. Not only that, but you can also have somebody go to that home page, whatever it is, and then have them go somewhere else completely immediately without the user ever even knowing. So these are possibilities. I also want you to notice here a couple little things, and I realize that we're going to get repeat on this stuff, and I'm throwing a lot at you at once, but I think it's kind of cool to start absorbing it. And oh my gosh, Microsoft has another curveball in here. I'm really kind of interested in this now. In the past, when I would do these expandos, right, these little triangle drop downs, you open up your default ASPX file and you would get, notice, default ASPX.cs. So what's that? Computer science? C#. If yours has a VB after it, you chose Visual Basic instead of C#. Now, what's interesting about this, I'm going to click on it. This is a C# file. It's a back-end programming code that is tied directly to this page. So I could write code and place it here within the class file to do whatever we wanted to do. We don't have to put anything here, but we could put something here. Regular programming code that would drive the content on the page somehow, or create interactivity, or do math, or whatever you can do with programming code. Now, I'm really curious because this is brand new. I've never seen this before. This is brand new. It says auto-generated. This code is generated by a tool, may cause incorrect behavior. So guess what I'm going to do? I'm not going to touch this. I need to research this. This is brand new in Visual Studio 2019, folks. Here's your instructor being completely clueless about it because I've never seen it before, but I'm going to definitely be reading up. But what really intrigues me is the fact that these files have expanders. Okay, and I see what they're doing here. So what they're doing here is really they're breaking down each one of the files into its components. So what this is saying is the C# file has got a class called default. Notice underscore default. So that's an object within that page. And then default, the class, also has an object inside of it, which is the page load function. So in other words, if I wanted to have some programming code execute automatically when the page loads, I would place it here. So if I wanted to, let's say, pull the system date and time, I could pull that and then turn it into text and put it on the screen.
So you could add functions in here?
Absolutely. Anything that you can do in a programming language, you could throw in here. So it's a lot different than, let's say, working with JavaScript, where the code is interpreted. Here you have the capability of writing real, compiled code that can interact with databases and do all sorts of things that you could not normally do in a browser.
Because those headers there, like on 10 and 12, lines 10 and 12, when I looked at that looked a lot like Java itself.
Well, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And it does look like Java. And more precisely, Java looks like C and C++, and this is a C-style language.
I took a C++ class years ago, and the top of that, 2 through 6, reminded me of, I can't remember the code you used in C++, but maybe it was using, but you loaded all, and in the top of the code, you loaded the
Right. Yeah, in Java you do what? You do imports.
Yeah.
In C# you do using, and I forget what it is for C and C++. I forget if that's import or, we can look it up.
The other day.
But you could just like probably pull up a sample like C++ file and see it. But this structure that you see is fascinating. I'm really more intrigued with this because what I'm seeing here says default ASPX designer. So what this is telling me is we could attach like visual things here. I really have to explore this, and I'm just very intrigued. I mean, that's about all I can say about it right now. But any one of these files that you see that's got the expander behind it, that's an ASPX file, will always have what we call a code file attached to it. The terminology that we use for reference is called code behind. The code behind the page. So it's kind of the equivalent, if you think of a regular HTML page where you create a separate JavaScript file and a separate CSS file, and then you link to them. This is essentially the same thing. This file is automatically linked to that document by default. We didn't create it. Every time I would add a page to this project, it would add that automatically. If I go back to the original page and look at the code, let's go way up to the top and take a look at how this is structured. I want you to notice a couple things. Page title. Apparently there's some sort of like a master page. It tells us what language we're using. That's nice. The code behind. Oh, there is a code behind file. It tells us what it is, just in case it's named something different. And then it also says it inherits something or other. So that we'll have to figure out. But what that is, if you notice, is the structure that we have inside the class files. That's really what it is. Right. So that top section on any ASPX page that is built on top of what we call a master page or a template file is going to always have that. You're never going to see doc type, head, title, all the stuff you were taught to put in HTML files because they are somewhere else. This is a server-side technology. So what happens is we take whatever's here and we push it into a template, and then the engine runs and it outputs HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is what the browser reads. The browser cannot read this code. It can read the HTML parts, but not any of the ASPX parts. That's done by our server. The other thing that's fascinating here is this line. And we'll get deeper in, so you can save some of your questions for chapter 2, I suppose, or 3. And notice how this one begins. This is, well, the first one is like, okay, so we got a bracket and a percent sign and an @ sign. That's confusing enough. We'll talk about that. And then we have like ASP tags with a colon and it says content. Those are special directives. So what this is telling the engine is that this is the content section of our page. Now they have some tasks that they want us to perform. So I want to and I might be kind of stealing my own thunder here, but they ask us to do a very specific thing, and that is they want us to come in here and remove all the code that's inside the ASP content section and replace it with hello world, because that gives our life meaning apparently. So let's just copy it. I'm copying it right from the PDF file of the book, and I'm going to follow their instructions. So I'm going to just come in here, highlight all of this, right? I don't want to get rid of the closing tag, and just paste in those 2 lines. You want to indent it and make it pretty, go ahead. Okay, so we get what this does, right? I hope, right? We got an H2, so hello world, not really big, but kind of big, and then a paragraph with some text. And then once again, here we got that weird percent sign thing one more time. And this time, instead of an @ sign, we got a colon. All right, so here's the great mystery, and we will discuss this more, but that bracket percent if you've learned PHP, for example, in PHP, how do you start PHP code?
Question mark PHP.
Yep. Bracket, question mark, PHP. And depending on how your server is configured, sometimes you can eliminate PHP and just use bracket, question mark. And that's called a PHP delimiter, right? It tells the compiler on the server, hey, this is PHP code, you need to run this code before we send it back. With ASP, whenever you see the % with a bracket, and it's also true in several other backend languages, Java, for example, is one of them as well. That's an ASP style delimiter, and it indicates that there is programming code coming. Now what's in between here isn't really too hard to figure out, right? These are pre-built functions that are in the .NET libraries. Date time, okay, well, the day and time. Now, okay, so what day and time is it right now? Grabs it, and then converts it to a string, and then drops it in position right there.
If it's running on the server, is it grabbing the server date time or your client date time?
That's an excellent question. Server date time. For us who are coding on our own machine, it's going to pull our own machine's date time. If your server happens to be on the West Coast, so sometimes developers work on the East Coast, but all their servers are on the West Coast, and they're like, hey, this is 4 hours off. That's because it's West Coast. So, all right. I'm assuming now the book is saying run the code. All right, so that's what we're going to do. So let's talk about how to run the code. First of all, there's this little play button up here at the top, right? And yes, you can go ahead and press it if you wish, but I want you to make some selections before you just, randomly go clicking all over the place. I want you to hit that little drop down first, and then notice what your options are. Well, first of all, the play button is associated with whatever I've deemed as defaults. So if you have a default browser on your system that's, let's say, Firefox, right? Mine is Chrome. You might have Firefox. That might pop up, but I'm going to tell you what, most likely it probably says Internet Explorer or Edge. I'm looking at my student's face. Yours says Chrome also, so it automatically picks it up. And the older versions, often it would push you to Internet Explorer, even when you didn't want to go there. Okay, so, but if you wanted to change whatever browser would launch automatically, here's a spot where you can do it. You guys should all know that at this point in time, there's more browsers than just the ones on this list. The ones on this list are definitely the significant ones. Google Chrome, by far the most popular. Internet Explorer on its way out, should have been out a long time ago. Edge, still not too crazy about it, but from what I understand, they're building it now on top of Chromium, so eventually it will support all the Chrome plugins and features, so it'll be even more like Chrome. And then there's Firefox, of course, which is really many web developers' tool of choice, just so you guys know. I mean, more so than Google Chrome often. I'm going to stick with Chrome because that's just what I'm using. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that button, and I want to explain what happens as I hit that. When I first hit it, you can see an output window opens here at the bottom. And it says build started. So what it's doing right now is it's looking at any code files, any C# code and any of the code that sits behind the project, compiles it before it can put out a web page. So it's also, because it's the first launch, this is the first launch of the internal web server that's built into Visual Studio. It takes a little bit of time. I have a reasonably fast machine, so i7, like 3 gigahertz, I'm trying to think of the specs here, 16 gigs of RAM, SSD, etc., and not super fast, but fast enough, and you saw how much time it took for it to load. And isn't this exciting? Look, hello world. And notice July 1st, 2019, 6:35, 42 p.m., which indicates that we need to take a break. That's pretty cool. Now, but what about this other stuff? It says application name. I already have a menu. Where did that come from? Well, that's built into the project template, folks. I didn't do any of that work. It just did it for me. In fact, can I click on that stuff? Yeah. It just put dummy content in there. Why does it do this? Because they figure most people that are building an ASP.NET website usually have a home page, you usually have a contact page, and you usually have an about page. And if you don't like those, you can get rid of them. But they're so common, why not just put them in there? And then all people have to do is change a couple of things, very simply in the code. And you know what? It looks really nice too. Right? Did you guys see all that CSS work I did? It does not look like you're playing old HTML. In fact, here's the other thing we're going to do. Let's right-click and view page source. All right, so as you do this in this environment, I think it's kind of fascinating. And by the way, as a web person, whenever you visit a website of intrigue, you should always do this. You should always look at the code that's coming up in the browser that's driving the page, because it tells you a lot about how the page is constructed. So notice, right off the bat, there is a doc type, and there is proper HTML document structure, and holy cow, where did all these scripts come from? And these weird, like, hidden inputs, and oh my god, I didn't put any of that stuff in there. You notice that? The engine did it for us. And not only that, if you zoom in a little bit here, see that they have this thing called the Modernizer. We'll talk about it. The Bootstrap CSS library, which makes it responsive and beautiful without us doing much of anything. The site CSS that we would develop, of course, a favorite icon. But then notice this other like weird stuff here. Notice these are input controls that are hidden. And notice that the whole page sits inside of a form. The reason for that is we created a web form application. So the whole website is a form. That's how they treat it in ASP.NET. The other thing that's fascinating is without a lot of particular searching, it does not take a lot of effort to figure out what created this. You know, for example, this is a pretty good clue, ASP.NET hidden, what engine created it. Notice though, as we scroll down, and we get to the part where we actually see the stuff on the screen, which is this part, right? Particularly this little section where we have the date and time. Notice there's no code there, that's just the output of the code. Code ran on the server, happens to be our own machine or Visual Studio, converts it to text, puts it back on the screen. You have really basic, clean, well-structured HTML through most of the document. There are some scripts that run here, and we'll talk about those as we go. And a lot of this stuff is embedded on the fly, mind you. And then just a couple of other clues of what environment we're working within. And yes, there's this thing we call inside an ASP.NET environment, that's the view state engine. And the job of that is to provide something that you don't typically have in an HTML application, and that is the tracking of the session. And I think we talked about that a little bit last week. And what that means, folks, is that a server-side web application can do some things that a client-side web application cannot do without a server. Namely, keep track of the users as they're logged in, and what activity is going on in terms of the active session. So notice it's got this, like, I don't know how many characters that is, it's long, but that is basically a key that drives, it's like a session token that drives the application and makes it unique. So if we had multiple people hitting the same website, some of that might be a little bit different because there are different users using the same application. All right, so I think that's something you should get in the habit of doing, is whatever code you're using to create this, right, is not the same thing that you're seeing on the website. We will break this down further and further. Now, in terms of if you're doing your homework, right, so here's the big question I always get: how do you want me to do the homework, right? Well, first thing I do is I read the instructions. I know it sounds silly, right? But your instructor has instructions for your assignments. And the book has instructions, and sometimes they're the same and sometimes they're a little different. But what I suggest is you get into the class here. Oop, wrong class, sorry. That was spring, this is summer. And here we are in Unit 1, and we're doing Chapter 1. And what I ask you to do, complete the 2 try-it-outs. So we're working on the first one. Take several screenshots of the code and program running as you work and embed them into a Word document with some brief narrative. You do not need to submit your code. You can, I don't care if you do, but at this point in time, that's not my concern. Okay, so let me just demonstrate what I think is the best way to do this. If you're using Microsoft Word, and you should, it really is, the best application to use for something like this. You could use Google Docs or the online version of Word too, that's up to you. I would create a new document, and I might say asp.net, I don't know, chapter 1, I don't know, whatever the exercise number is, exercise 1. Title it, make it look pretty, and say, this first exercise was awesome, right? Like students would actually type that. Some of them do. But talk about your experiences. This went great. I really didn't have any problems, or I was a little confused by the templates at first, but I worked it out, and then I discovered how to fix it. It didn't work at first, but then I figured it out. Whatever your comments are. And then I also would like you to take several screenshots of the code and program running as you work. So here's the way I would do that. I would first come in here. The only page that we altered, right, was this one. So I'm going to start by bringing up my snipping tool. If you guys didn't know this existed in Windows, now you know. This is how you do partial screen grabs. You don't have to grab the whole screen. If you're grabbing the whole screen, you're usually maybe overachieving a little bit. What I would do is I would probably just grab only the pertinent part of it, like that. That's enough, right? Just the pertinent code. So I'm going to copy that. I'll go back to Word, and yes, you can paste in an image. Looks great. Now I want to show you what isn't a great thing to do. Like if I did do a screenshot, so if I hit the print screen button, and let me see if I can do that here. No, I don't want to save it to OneDrive right now, thank you. All right, so I'm assuming that that's in my copy-paste buffer. Let's see if it drops the whole screen in there. Okay, and it does. Oh, actually dropped both of my screens in there. That's really easy to read, right?
Well, you can edit that.
Yeah, you can. But that's a really large file, much larger than it needs to be compared to the one above. So one comment you might get early on is don't screenshot the whole screen, just screenshot, zoom in, use the snipping tool. Yeah, you can edit this, but the problem is, I could switch to actually the crop tool, right? And crop it to actually make the image smaller. But what happens is you're still working with the same size image, file-wise, right? I might be able to trim it down to the same shape and make it just as big, but all that data for that image is still in the background, and then when you turn in that Word file, instead of it being a couple megabytes, it's 20 megabytes because you got 50 screenshots that are full screen and you shrunk them down. I recommend that you use the snipping tool to kind of narrow it up a little bit. But that's basically the procedure. The other thing that I would like you to do, so I'm going to delete that, is get it running, and it looks like it's still running. How do I know it's still running? Because up here at the top, it's got a stop button and a pause button instead of a play button, and it shows me in this diagnostic window that there's an active process going that shows how much system resources are being applied to it. So I'm going to go back to the browser here, assuming that I have it open. And there's the successful page, right? Once again, the snipping tool, doing your screen grab. And you know, if you want to grab the tabs at the top, I guess you could. I would probably be happy with just this much. Right? See, look, the strategy here. Back over to the Word document, paste it in. So show me the code, show me the application running. Now, in later chapters when we actually are building things that are more complex, you might opt to zip your code and submit it with the document, just so you have a backup, and just in case you have problems and I can help you figure it out. Unfortunately, a lot of times with ASP.NET code, depending on how you've done the work, sometimes it's difficult to open it on other machines, depending on how the files are saved and where they're located. So there's little concerns there too. But this is the basic approach. When you do submit these screenshot documents, I do also ask that you do not zip the screenshots, so don't put them inside of a zip file, because then I can't see them inside of Blackboard, where if you just submit it as a regular document, the moment I go into my grade book in Blackboard, it just pops up on my screen and I can see it. I don't have to open Word, it just does it right in the environment and I attach a score to it. I might give you some comments on how that works out, but it's a pretty simple little process, honestly. If you guys get stuck doing that, let me know. Now I'm going to go ahead and close this tab, which is my application running, and then when I go back to Visual Studio, I thought I closed the tab, right? But the web server is still running in the background. Now, I can type in here, but you know what? That won't push out to the application until I hit save, and I can't hit save while the web server is running. And if I can, it's not on all the files. So what I recommend, and see, you don't want to delete that stuff, is you stop the web server before you make additional changes. Right. So it's a different way to work than what you might be used to for most web development. Of course, this page is now not saved, so I'm going to Control S and save it. But I also want to point out a distinction here. If I come up here and do Control S, what is it saving? Just that document? So if I made changes to 5 documents, that wouldn't have saved all of them. So some people learn this shortcut, which is Control Shift S, which saves everything in the project, or you look for that multiple icon here where you can save all. I'm sometimes cautious with that though. General rule of thumb though is always try to save your work. All right, let's go ahead and close this down and call this try it out exercise complete. I'm now going to jump back over to the book, and we're going to move forward, and I'm going to see if there's any pertinent stuff that I haven't already talked to death. I think we did all that, but let's talk about some of the mechanics here quickly. Now, whenever we work with a traditional, HTML page, you get this sort of like diagram working here, where you have a web browser, it goes to the server, and it asks for a file. It reads the file, sends it back to you, and your browser does whatever it says and puts it up on your screen. Now the truth is, all that web server is really doing is sending you a file. It's not processing code, right? It just says, here's the file, load it up in your browser, good luck. The browser will process CSS and JavaScript because it knows how to work with those. It does not know how to work with ASP.NET or Java or PHP or any of the other backend languages that are out there. That's the job of the web server. So when we work with ASP.NET, the web server also has to run the code before it sends anything back. So that's a thing that I think is kind of interesting. All right. Now, the next section here is one that I'm going to fly through really quick because you know what it's about? HTML. So the assumption here, folks, is you already know this. This book is written for people who may not know this or might not know it well. So they go through and they talk about what HTML is and what HTML5 is. And my assumption for you coming into this class is that you're well versed in this already. If you feel like your skills are waning a little bit or you don't remember them, please go out there and do some refresh on HTML. Lots of good stuff out on the net, for sure. Right. They go through the whole structure of HTML documents. These are things you should already know, but just as a refresh, you can just rifle through here. These are the key document components. A lot of tags you should know. Hopefully none of these are foreign to you. You know, the big move that we had when we converted from older versions of HTML and XHTML to HTML5 was this thing called the semantic web, where they started to take tags and convert them into tag names in HTML5, which describe the structure of the content that's being put inside them, as opposed to using a lot of div tags and giving them IDs. And that was a real big move, plus some of the other things that they did underneath the hood. All the different little components of HTML5, you guys know how to do comments. I assume you know what an attribute is. All right, they show the rules of HTML5. Notice how, and this is kind of interesting, when we used to do XHTML, if a tag was what we call a self-closing tag, old HTML used to allow no closing slash, and then they came out with XHTML, which was really strict because it's built on XML, and you had to put these closing slashes at the end. Now, what's fascinating about that is technically in HTML5 you don't really need those. However, when you're working with certain back-end languages, Java, like we work like JSP, for example, in Java, or if you're working with some ASP content, it is required that you put in those closing slashes for self-closing tags. Image tags and line breaks are the most common ones, because otherwise some things just will not work because they're built on XML. So you got to kind of combine the two. So I think that's interesting. Attributes, of course, are the things that you put inside of tags to expand what they're doing. The image tag is a great one. So this just tells you what file is being loaded up. Usually attributes are in double quotes, but single quotes work as well. You know what's kind of interesting is when they originally came out with HTML5, somebody said, why do we even need the quotes? You know what? And then after a while they put them back because we're like, well, this is confusing everybody. Look. So, you know, the truth is you can do it any one of those ways and it all works. Depending on what backend languages you're working with though, and here's the catch again, the ones that are usually finicky about that closing slash are also finicky about the attributes being proper. Technically by rule, HTML5 allows attributes without quotations. A lot of people don't know that. My general rule of thumb as a programmer though is put them in because you don't know if it's going to end up in a back-end application, and the last thing you want is to have to go back through for a few days and add double quotes to everything, right? They talk about nesting things, the doc type. So do you know what the purpose of the doc type is? It's a good question, right? All the doc type is a declaration of what version of HTML we're using. When you see this doc type, it indicates HTML5. Right. When you look at the doc types for HTML4 or other versions, they are long cryptic strings, sometimes followed by subsequent strings that have to be precisely right in order for the application to work. And that was such a problem for programmers prior to this that when they came up with this standard, they're like, can we get rid of all that stuff? Okay. I mean, and it was a smart move, I think. So that's something good to know. Now let's move on to something new. And that is this thing that we were kind of talking about before, and that is the ASP tags. So what they're doing here is, and I want to make a distinction here, this is not old style ASP scripting, this is ASP.NET scripting. It only works with the .NET environment. But if I wanted to put a .NET button on a page, I could use what we see below the HTML approach, right, which was what we were taught. Input, I want a submit button, so I just put in a button, right? So I say input, type submit, etc. ASP, though, because it's using its own back-end engine, will prefer that you use the ASP controls. So when you pull control, and just like in regular Visual Studio programming, you have palettes so you can pull a button and drag and drop it onto a page. And boom, you have a button. And the code is written for you, but it will create ASP code. When you run it on the server and you look at it in the browser, it turns into what you see highlighted. So the users don't see what's above, they see what's below. They don't see this. But this, when it runs through the server, becomes that. That's the byproduct of being processed. Now you might ask yourself, okay, why can't we just put this code in the application? You know, the truth is you can. It'll still work, but the programmability of it changes and the way that you trigger things. If you're running JavaScript code, you can go with the input tag. But if you're running C# code and other tools from .NET, you want to go with the above one because then it's interactive with those. It gives you a lot more power. So that's like a real popular question.
So just to back up, so C# wouldn't be able to interact with the HTML code. It only interacts with the ASP tags.
No, it can interact with HTML as well. So the question was, can C#? The question was, so HTML cannot interact, or C# cannot interact with HTML, but it actually can.
It can.
Yeah. What? Okay, I know where your mind's going. So what's the point?
Yeah.
Yeah. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. So what will happen is you'll stick with the ASP type of controls because you're in that environment, and that way you're using, like, you know, once again, that set of tools.
Similar tools.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. A little uncomfortable at first, but you get the hang of it pretty quick. All right, we're talking about Visual Studio, and Visual Studio is what we call an IDE. So if you ever hear that acronym, and what that stands for is Integrated Development Environment. And I always tell people there's lots of great IDEs out there, but most professional developers still consider Visual Studio kind of king of the hill. There, you know, and you'll hear arguments about that, but you know, truth be told, out in the work world, especially in the Windows world, that's what people are using. What amazes me is how much web work has really transitioned over to Visual Studio. And I think we're seeing it change a little bit, so it'll be interesting to see where it goes. All right, they talk about kind of the layout of Visual Studio, and even though this is a really old screenshot, really the formats are basically the same. You see Solution Explorer on the right. You have a big code window area in the center. Down in the bottom right corner, you have a little properties area. And then you'll notice, you know, at times there's all these little things that kind of drop in that you can activate. Like, for example, there's a toolbox off to the side. Is that in ours? Well, we don't have one open right now, but yes, it is. In fact, I can actually see it right now, but I don't have a product open. So if I click that, it would bring up my toolbox. We'll take a look at that in a little bit. So getting used to that environment is kind of one of the first things. Visual Studio is not a simple product, right? It's very complex and robust and can do a lot of different things. Kind of like Microsoft Word or Excel are the same way. There's so much that those products can do. You can spend like a whole career working in that product and never even use all the features. Visual Studio is kind of the same way. Although if you get into professional development and you get very specific in certain types of tasks, you can get to know it very deeply. That's only by virtue of spending a lot of time working with it. All right. One of the things that is kind of interesting is when you're working in Visual Studio, there are configuration options based upon the templates that you choose. It is a highly configurable environment. So what I'm trying to point out here is, let's just go ahead and, you know what, let's just open up the project that we had already worked on, just so we have something to look at on the screen. I'm working right now on a dual screen machine. All the little panels inside here are controllable. So like wherever there's a split bar like this, you can make your Solution Explorer really big. If I want to make my properties window a little taller or shorter, you can move those things around. It's not, if you want to turn them off, you can do that, and then you can bring them back if you want. What a lot of developers end up doing, especially if they're multi-screening, which most of them do, 2 screens at a minimum for most developers. I've been seeing a lot going like 3, 4, and more now, believe it or not, is to take these panels and just pull them off and move them somewhere else. And then you can save your settings as a profile and then call them back. So for example, if I'm just working on my laptop, I might have a profile for laptop. And then if I go home and plug into my screens, I might have like the home coding environment, or here at work I might have a different one. And what you'll discover is that everybody has their own favorite way to work, and usually what it is to try to maximize so you don't have to see, move things around to see all the stuff you need to see at the same time. So you can customize those things. But what they're trying to show us here is that there's an area right here, and in the book they say Tools, Settings, right? So if you look at the instructions here, go to the Tools Settings menu. Well, that's true for Visual Studio for Windows Express, right? The old version. But in the more modern version, you just go to Tools, Import Export Settings. Now, I'm going to go in here, I'm going to show you this, because if you do have settings that you've created for your layout of the windows and all the little tabs and stuff, you can actually save it and recall it. So you can, and then import and export it to other machines if you choose. But if you ever like screw things up so bad, so let's say you get rid of Solution Explorer and you have no clue how to bring it back, right? Or you're like, I tried this different layout and I hate it. Can you just take me back to normal, please? This is where you would fix it. So you would come to this particular menu, choose Import Export Settings, and notice I could export my settings so I could use them somewhere else. I could import from somewhere else, right? Or I just want to reset. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do, and click Next. And then if I want, I can save my settings, give them a name for future export or import. Or, nah, don't worry about it. Just reset everything, no worries. Click Next. And then right now, we're in general mode, right? But if you wanted, you could switch to web development since we're web developers, right? So you could do that. Now, does the book tell us which approach to switch to? Yeah. No, they don't. But my suggestion for you would be to choose web development. And you know what that one looks like? We'll see. Pretty much what we have already. Okay, so I think that's a pretty helpful tip, folks. All right, so keep that one in mind. All right. They go through here and they talk about all the different things that are available in the toolbar areas and the toolbox. Let's actually, since I have Visual Studio open, let's go ahead and click on that toolbox so you can see the kind of stuff that pops up. And you can see right up here, it's like, well, nothing appears. Well, it's initializing right now, first use. So it's pulling in all the tools. And then if you go into any one of these particular areas, so if I go to the standard toolbox, you're going to notice all these different things, right? Remember that example above where they dropped a button onto the page? Well, I can find button here, and I can just drag and drop it into my code, and check it out. I have a button. It's outside the content area, that's not good, but I can just drag and drop it up here. And then if I compiled it and ran it, you would see that it would turn into that input field. See how easy that was to add a button? You know what's, so when tools like this first came out, all the old school coders like me would go, that's cheating, you don't know what you're doing. Okay, and then I changed my mindset a little while in after working with it. I'm like, no, wait. That's like accelerated workflow, and I'm not making any mistakes. I'm not forgetting a bracket or misspelling something, because that will really break things quickly. So it's a beautiful, quick way to work, and what seems like cheating at first eventually becomes so second nature that you'll wonder why you ever did it without. Okay, so that's just a really, really quick example. We talked about the Solution Explorer already. The Database Explorer is something we're going to see right towards the end of class. And guess what you do with that tool? You can look at, guess what you do with that tool? You look at your databases. So if you can connect your applications to a database, and then within Visual Studio, you can connect to that database and interact with it.
And you can save that connection string?
Absolutely. The Properties window, that's the one that's in the lower right corner. So sometimes we'll be working with any object on the screen, and any object on the screen that we're interacting with, and you notice how I click on different things and that property window changes, will have various properties associated that you can control. All right. Right now, there's not too much in here, but if we did put stuff in here, anything that's inside of a property window, by the way, is something you can programmatically control with C# code. So if you wanted to make something visible or invisible, and there's a property for it in here, you can write code to do that for you, which I think is really kind of neat. Property windows just shows you the current status. Document window, of course, is where we work with code. So we've already done that. All right. So it says here, there's also a start page, right? So it says here, if you want to see the start page, I want to go up to the view menu and see if they even have that as an option anymore, because my memory says no, but I could be wrong. And no, my memory is right, because I don't see anything here that says start page. You notice that? And what they're referring to is what we saw up on the screen when we first launch. That's not it. That's not it. Right? So I'm looking at all these like really weird files here. None of them are it.
Are you looking for how to set your start page?
No, not how to set it, but the page that we saw when we first landed there. See, this is one of these version differences of the product. That's what we're experiencing right now. But what's fascinating, if you do want to change which page is the default page that you land on when you start, whenever you right-click on any one of these files, you'll see that it has the option there to set whatever that page is as the home page. So it does not have to be default, it's just default by default. And this is how simple it is to change it. Got to be careful with that though, because sometimes that can come back to bite you. So I usually recommend for ASP.NET applications that you leave default as your home page for the most part. We're going to now work on this second application here, and hopefully it shouldn't take too long because step one's already done. We already have Visual Studio open. Then they want us to go and they want us to choose expert settings. Now, I want to point out to you, this is where we just went before, right? We went to tools. You notice import export settings is what we want. Okay, we're going to reset again. Yes, I know we just did this. But the point was to switch to expert mode, right? Do you guys see that? It's not there. The web development mode is the expert setting mode for this template because it's geared towards web development. So basically we're already there. So that's if you made that selection. If you stayed in general mode, the truth is it's almost identical, so there's not a lot of worry there. All right. Now we're going to go ahead now and go through and build a new website again. So let's go ahead and close the current one, and once again you go to File, Close Solution, and now we're going to do a new project again. We're going to go through the same steps, right? Now I'm assuming they want us to, at this point, create an empty one. Okay, we're keeping it pretty simple, it looks like. So what we're doing is we'll choose the same framework, but we don't want the web forms now, do we? Or do we? We don't. No, I don't think so either. So let's choose C#. Windows. Web. Web should be at the top, right? To make it easier for us. Then we're going to choose our .NET framework. Go to the next page. And I'm sure they ask you to name it something, so name it whatever they tell you to name it. Okay. And here's where, this is the form that they want us to create. That's different. Okay, they just want us to call it, I see it now, website 2. And this is calling it web app. Okay, that's close enough, right? If you want to call it website 2, go ahead. All right, I'm leaving it in the default folder for now. Solution in the same directory. That .NET framework is fine. And then create. Now we're asked for web forms. Now, do I need to add a web form reference here? My feeling is no. Let's choose empty. If I screw up, you know what? We can come back and choose it again, right? Practice makes perfect. Oh, apparently I already have a web application 3. I better choose a different file name. Let's call it web application 333,000 or whatever. All right, let's do that. And they want us, do you want to change the solution file? Yeah, may as well. We chose empty, no HTTPS. Okay, now why is it doing this? All right, I got to take a look. So I'm going to go to my file system here, folks, really quick. See if we can figure out why it's doing this. Project already exists. When a project is created, it must be placed within a new folder of the same name. So what, I have to rename it again? Didn't I just do that?
I just uncheck the box and then let me see it.
All right, let's do it. Sure. That's because when I screwed up the first time, it kept using the same solution file. That's the why. Okay. We decided to go empty, and now it's building out the project. All right, let's see what it wants us to do first. All right. Okay. And they make a point here that make sure it's an empty website, not a form site, so you don't want those forms options. So that's a for sure. All right. When we're inside the application now, I want you guys to take a look at that Solution Explorer and take a look at the area that's highlighted right now. You notice how the web application is bolded? That is the root of our site right there. So when they're asking you in the instructions, make sure you click the website labeled website 2, not the parent solution element. So they do not want you to right click here. They want you to right click here. Right? There's a difference. This holds all the projects that are part of the project, or all the programs that are part of the project, and this holds this particular one. So we don't want to add it wherever, we want to add it to this particular one. So that's where we're going to right click and add new item. So right here on the root, we're going to right click, add, it took a while to come up, and then we're going to choose new item from the screen. Now that procedure, and I'm going to repeat it one more time for you, right click on the root of the project, not the solution but the root, click add, and then select new item. So this is kind of like the pathway to get there. Now I want you to notice as we hover here, before I go getting all click happy, look at all the different stuff that came up here. And you know what? In this version, which is 2019, they've really kind of expanded it. So a new item would be to if you're going to add an HTML file or a CSS file, whatever it is you're adding to the project, this is where you do it from. But you could also have something in your file system. You might have something from a different project that you want to pull over, so you can pull that over from an existing item. You can just make a folder, etc. But I also want you to notice at the bottom, not the very, very bottom, but the section above where there's HTML and JavaScript. So real common types of files that you might add to this project from this location would be located here. And sometimes, if you know you're putting in like a JavaScript file or whatever, you can just select it from there. But if you're not sure, you can always come up to New Item, and then you will have available the old-fashioned interface. Finally, something that's making me comfortable here. But you can, oh my God, the stuff that you'll find in here is pretty amazing. So notice that left-hand side, our document, or our selection tree, if you want to look at it that way, Visual C#, in the web section, and what kind of stuff do they want us to add? What is the book asking for? Click web form. So you told us not to select it, now you're having us add one? Yeah, exactly. And that's to show you something is basically why the guy's doing it. So, oh heck, I don't know if I see web form. I do, but I'm just kind of playing dumb. So what I'm going to do here is you can actually come up to the search bar and just start typing, and of course, like most good search engines, it narrows it down, and there it is. There's a web form. They're going to want us to name that web form, and they want us to name it Controls Demo. Hey, may as well copy paste. It's right there. Right, so I'm just going to click that in here. I'm not worried about adding the ASPX down here because it's going to add it for me automatically. So if I don't type it in, it's going to put it in. If I do, it just uses it. We're going to go ahead and click Add, and there it is. Now you notice something different here? We're not working with a pre-built template, so all of a sudden it does have a doc type. Right? Because, and what's happening is we're not injecting this content into a pre-existing structure, we're building it from scratch. Okay? And so at the very top of the page are the ASP directives here. And I'm noticing my word wrap is turned off. You noticing that? Yeah, that's. Yeah. Now, I'm not really too worried about that right now. So let's go ahead and follow the next instruction. All right. They want us to switch to design view. Now this is somewhere where when you look at products like more primitive text editors, they don't have tools like this. So let me show you right down here at the bottom. Bottom left corner on my screen, there are 3 buttons along the bottom that say Design, Split, and Source. Whenever you're looking at straight up code, you're in source code view. You can switch to Design view, and there's a blank page with like a body with a box and a ... Or I can go to Split view and see both. So now I have to talk about this a little bit because design view is a really rough, and I want to emphasize, really rough graphical representation of what you're creating with code. It is not the output you're going to see in the browser. However, there's some stuff that you can do in the graphical view that makes it a little bit easier to do some work rather than working in the code, especially if you don't know how to code that well. So it's easier to type content in. So for example, there's a div here, right? If I start typing, okay, click here to synchronize views. See that message? And it updates it. Okay. Oh, well, could I type here? Yeah, that's pretty cool, right? So they'll have you switch to design view like that, but I want to make sure I delete the junk I just put in. So I'm Control-Zing it to get rid of it. That's the magic button on computers. All right. So we're in design view, and they tell us here, if the toolbox isn't open yet, press Control-Alt-X to open it, or click the toolbox tab. So just to kind of review that, there it is. But if you don't see it and you don't remember that key combination, you can always go to the view menu, and the toolbox is right here. So you can always bring it up. Now, I'm in a mode right now with the toolbox. It's active, but as soon as I click off of it, it goes away. You can actually click that, and if you notice up here in the toolbar, and you guys might know this already, there's a little, looks like a push pin. And if I click that, then it locks into place and it's always on the side. Okay, so that's something you might want to do. It's up to you. Okay, I do want to make sure that I'm in design view though, because that's what my instructions say. So here I am in design view. Okay. All right, now it says drag a text box and a button from the standard category of the toolbox into the dashed area of the design view of the page. And it should look kind of like this when you're done. So you're going to be dragging a text box, and click, drag and drop, and it's going inside the dashed box. And there it is. Now I don't know if you can see this or not, because now we have the text box active. That dashed line is still there, super faint, but it's still there. In fact, if I wanted, I could click in it. And now that other tool is disabled. And notice as I switch from like the text box, right above it, it shows me what object I'm working with and its ID as I'm working with it. And in the properties window, that's becoming the active object. And you'll notice, like, oh wow, back color, border color. Well, I can like just click on menus and pick colors. You guys noticing that? This is like pretty cool. Maybe that's not the best color choice, but I'm making it anyhow. At least I think I did it. Yeah, my machine's being a little sluggish, probably because I'm recording video right now. It shouldn't normally be that slow. Makes me wonder what else is my machine doing right now that it's going so slow. Did yours work just fine? Okay. I have to assume something else is going on in the background of my machine. I'm not pushing it that hard, but every once in a while, you know, certainly Windows is working just fine. All right, kind of like watching paint. There we go. All right, so it did change my border color to pink. Looks horrible. Don't do it. But I'm just showing that how easy it is by just changing a property. And if I click back here, and now I look at that, I picked it from a color palette, but I put in the hex code for it. And if you wanted, and you know what your hex codes are, you could just manually tweak them. Not a big deal.
While you're changing these properties, is it updating a CSS attribute file too?
It is. And not exactly. We'll take a look at the code page. Ideally, it would drop it into a CSS file, but what it does is it puts in embedded CSS in the head section of the document attached to the ID, which then you could take and put into a separate file if you so choose. But the point here really is that's a property that we can control through code. You can do it through JavaScript and CSS as well, but you can also do it through ASP.NET code. All right, let's do the button now. So I'm going to click outside of that text box. I'm probably going to type in a space. Now this is experience speaking, because I don't want that button to touch the box. That's just me. I think it looks bad that way. So I'm going to grab a button, drag and drop. And there it is. Switch back to the book and see what they say. Text box and a button. And then you should get something that looks like that. Now it says number 9. Right-click the button in Design View and choose Properties. In the Properties grid, locate the text property and change it from Button to Submit Information. Actually, Submit Information. So let's do that. So I'm going to right-click the button and Properties. Now, if your Properties box was hidden, it would now appear. But it's already on the screen, but the guy is showing you what to do. Over here in the properties window, I'm going to pull this up a little bit so we get to see most of it. You can like scroll through here and look at all the different categories. And some of the categories have expanders. So if I wanted to change the font and the color, it's all right here. I wouldn't necessarily recommend changing it this way, but you can. But they wanted us to find a thing that says, what did they want us to find? text?
Yeah, I do.
Boy, that would really be helpful if it was alphabetical. So guess what? They have a button for that. See this? You can click that button, and sometimes it's easier to find the property this way, because the default is category view, which sometimes is helpful, but it depends on how you like to work, but it's easy to switch back and forth. I'm going to go to text, and then instead of button, we're going to change that to submit information. Press enter, and notice up on the design view, it's already changed on the button. All right. Next thing that they want us to do is launch the page. Now, I want you to notice here in the instructions, step 10, instead of saying hit the play button, they're now saying do Control F5. Now, any of you that have worked with Visual Studio in the past know that if you press F5, that's the play button. So why is Control F5 different? All right, let's go back and find out. Let's hover over this. Oh, and they don't even show the. All right, they don't even show that as an option here. All right, so let's go ahead and just press the play button. So apparently they have made it a little bit more intelligent. In the past, you would have the option, and for those of you working with an older version, I'm saying this so that you guys are aware. If you are presented with a screen that says run without debugging, run it without debugging. So that means we really don't have any back-end code on this yet, so there's no reason to debug code. But by default, it debugs code. So, oh, and you know what I didn't uncheck?
Oh.
Yeah, I didn't uncheck, yeah. Would you like to trust? Sure. Sure. It's not really doing anything, but all right. So now it's launching it, and what you're going to see, hopefully, on the page is what? A text box and a button with a bad pink border on part of the text field, hopefully. And hopefully it'll launch sometime today. And there it is. Okay. Notice how it doesn't look exactly like the design view. Other interesting thing to do, folks. Right-click, view source. You should always do this with these types of applications to see what's coming out. That ASP button changed. Let's compare the code in Visual Studio. So if I switch back to source code view, notice that ASP text box and ASP button and my non-breaking space are converted to traditional input controls for HTML after running on the server. That's the whole exercise. So if you got that working, go ahead, screenshot it, and move on. So one thing that happens is you're working in this application, sometimes you screw something up, right? And then you start getting errors at the bottom of the page. And the errors are designed to be very specific in terms of what's going on. So they might talk about validation issues or compiling errors. They'll give you which file is affected, which line, and specifically what's triggering it in there. And the whole point of it really is to help you troubleshoot it right within the application before you're publishing it and having problems out in the world. So hopefully none of you have had errors so far. If you do, then okay, then we'll talk. I did talk about the output window a little bit, and this is kind of more of a antiquated view of it, but they're also showing that you can also do a find. So if you are inside the environment and you want to find some code within your file, you can do a Control F. And they're also doing Control Shift F, which helps you find files versus content within a file. Right now, we're so short on content, there's not really much to find. But you see how quickly and easily it works? It's a really effective feature. Sometimes you'll be working on a project and you might, and I've had a couple of these where you get up to like 50 or 100 or a few hundred pages, and you want to go through and you want to change the same thing on all the pages, and you're using the same code, and you can use the find and replace to kind of one fell swoop correct it. always back up your work first is my advice on that one. All right, we talked about customizing the IDE a little bit and rearranging windows. The one thing that's kind of neat, you see these little icons that they have here when you do the rearranging? They're here to help you figure out where that thing is going to lay out. So if I go back to Visual Studio here, and let's say, well, let's stop the application for starters. Let's say I want to move the toolbox, right? These little icons here will, as I hover over that icon, it shows you where it's going to place it in the structure before you drop it. Isn't that cool? You know, and that's really where it belongs. You know, that's just what I'm used to. That's where I'm putting it. Okay, so you take that for whatever it's worth. That's the whole point of that little demonstration. That's kind of fun. Yes, you can change the toolbox or create a new one. We're in expert mode already. Okay, from the view menu. Okay, let's see here. From the same view menu, choose task list. Okay, we don't need to do that either. Okay, so and what really they're doing here is they're trying to trigger us into getting the output windows, and I'm not really too worried about that. I mean, if you really want to turn those on, you know, hey, go for it. You know, I find them more of an encumbrance than a benefit sometimes, but they usually get put down here in the output area. So if you have any problems, you know, and if you want problems, really all you have to do is like break some of your code. And did you see what just happened? I just got rid of like one bracket. And it says this end tag has no matching start tag. So it takes me to the closing tag and tells me it's not finding the starting tag, and then I can figure it out and put it back in. Right. And then what they want to show you is what I've been showing you, is that how you can drag the windows around. So we've already done that task. So if you want to show me how you rearranged your windows, you don't have to do exactly what they say, but do something so I can see that you know how to move things around a little bit. All right, now we're going to go back to that page that we were working on. So there it is, Controls Demo, it's open. And I don't know if they want us to be in Design View. I'm assuming we should be in Design View, right? Because they never told us to switch away. That's my thinking, right? Because we were looking at code. So let's be in Design View. And it says right-click the toolbox and choose Add Tab. So we can go to the toolbox. Right, so I'm just right-clicking inside here, and I'm going to say Add Tab. And then they want us to call it HTML fragments. And the truth is, if I was doing this work for myself, if I was creating my own tools, I would probably put my name in front of it, or like my initials or something like that. That's just me. So I know it's mine. Really easy to spot. All right. So really what we just did is we added a category in the toolbox where we can put our own stuff. Now this is really kind of a powerful thought here. So I can create stuff that I do. If I have stuff I use over and over again, I can save it as a fragment and then pull it into any project I want. Don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just pull it right in. It's right in your toolbox, just like any other tool. All right, so inside the document window, okay, with the document window showing your ASPH and markup view, so switch to code view after I switch to detail view. Type H1 directly after the opening div tag. So let's put in an H1. And what do they want us to put here? Just an H1. All right. Just an H1. I don't know what good that is, right? All right. And then it says highlight those H1 tags, both the opening and closing. And then you can drag and drop it into the fragments area. And then when you go back and look, oh, it took my pointer too. Right, I can remove. Okay. well, it doesn't really matter. I don't know if I accidentally moved it there. But here are my H1 tags. So whenever I want to add H1 tags to my document, if that's what I want to add, I don't know why I would do that, but there it is. It's as simple as that. So if you could imagine a whole block of code, right in. Isn't that kind of slick? Mm-hmm. All right. Make sure you screenshot that. It's probably better to rename this, heading, and I'm just going to say example, a bad one. But it's an example nonetheless. All right. I think that's a really neat little feature. A couple more things they have you do in Chapter 1 is look at, changing the look and feel of the development environment. Like currently I'm in like the traditional light colored mode, which I do prefer for teaching, frankly. I know a lot of people are into like dark mode themes these days, where it's a dark background and light text, and that usually works better if you're like in a darkened environment, like working at night, like in your mom's basement. I'm sorry, or wherever you happen to be working during non-daylight hours. But I'm in like, a lit classroom, and in order for stuff to look good on the big projector, I prefer a light background. But you can go in there, you can customize all this stuff to such a ridiculous extent, it's mind-boggling. My personal advice is leave it alone. The only change I would make is go from light mode to dark mode. If you really want to switch to dark mode, I will challenge you to figure it out on your own. It's really not that hard to do. There's actually instructions for it. All right. Yes, you can customize toolbars if you wish. You can also create your own keyboard shortcuts for things. One of my favorite keyboard shortcut things is, when I started learning computers, and copy paste is like a new thing. They didn't even call it copy paste. The concept came from some of the old Quark Express document editors they had back in the early 80s. Instead of, now we do like Control C, Control V, Control X, that's like cut, copy, paste. Back then you would yank and crank. Instead of cutting something, you'd yank it, and crank it is putting it back in. So, and the controls were Control Y and Control K. But that was just, that was a long time ago. So it's kind of nice that they've come up with standards. But if you have certain actions that you perform all the time, you can actually program them in through shortcuts, and it can do a lot of different things. I'm not really worried about that. If you're really that deep into Visual Studio, you'll figure that out on your own. Just know that it's a possibility. I already showed you how to reset the whole environment, which is a good thing. And really, any of the components can be reset too. So if you've done something to the toolbox right now, let's say you accidentally deleted a bunch of stuff, thank God there's a reset, right? But you can reset the whole environment, kind of a safety net. All right. One thing that the author is going to do with us, as we're finishing up Chapter 1 here, is he's going to take us to the, one thing we're going to be working on is we're going to be working on a website, and this does look a little dated at this point, but nonetheless, we're going to be building a website that kind of looks like this over the next few chapters. So we're going to learn how to put content in, create pages, create navigation, create ads, interactivity. You notice there's a theme selector, so we can change the entire look of the site by just clicking the drop down, and we're going to learn how to do all of that. It's kind of a cheesy little thing, but you know what? It's a good starting point, and that's really what we're looking for here. All right, that basically wraps Chapter 1, folks, and we're going to take a break here in the classroom. Here's the different theme, and there's the summary. And just be thankful I'm not making you answer the exercise questions, because I could. But it's not a bad idea to look at them, because sometimes they inspire me for tests and quizzes.
What I've asked other instructors is the solution for those, if you don't assign them as graded work, because they are helpful to study, but it helps to know that you have the right answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to know the right answer, you want to go through, we can go through these right now.
No, I mean, can you post the solution?
No.
Okay.
But if you wanted to, I'm sorry to be so weird about it. They don't have like an answer guide for these, but I can answer all of them, pretty much, so.
It'll help you to figure them out. If I don't think I have them right, I'll ask you.
Okay.
You don't have to take time in class to do that.
Yeah. Oh, look. So, it says that they're in black and white.
Oh.
You can find the answers to these in Appendix A. So you don't even have to ask the teacher.
I'll blame it on the monitor.
Yeah, right. Because it was like this, so I didn't see it, right?
Okay.
Or we could read what's on the screen. All right, folks, that ends this video and Chapter 1. When we come back, we're going to be moving into Chapter 2.